Quinton, I've known you for over 20 years. Incredible human being.
Thank you.
You're one of the most interesting men I've ever met. You're a scientist by background. So tell me, what did you study and where is it all going?
I was always very interested in biology and the natural world, really. I was a junior game ranger, even when I lived in Johannesburg. And then I landed up wanting to study biology, but I wasn't quite sure which side of biology. I was interested in human medicine, but then I was interested in wider biology too, say animals and plants. So I decided rather to do science rather than medicine. And then from that, I landed up being quite not as exciting when I landed up specializing, finishing my degree, because I landed up moving into chemistry and microbiology, which for me were quite exciting times because chemistry had the whole link to drugs and medicine, and then with microbiology is bacteria. So I decided to move into that. From that, I decided to do pharmacology as a master's degree, and that for me opened a lot of doors. And then I could actually understand the biology of the human being, the drugs and how they actually operate within people and also within animals. In fact, I used to work in clinical trials, a hospital in Cape Town, working on people with tuberculosis. Often they were quite ill, some of them, so we had to take some precautions because TB is still a massive problem in Africa. And we'd be looking at testing different drug combinations on them and see how they affected each other and see if the bioavailability changed, also depending on what they ate. So we'd take blood and then assist with these really interesting trials and make sure the drugs were actually working on people as they performed.
So you've got a pharmacology background.
Yeah.
One of the things that's always fascinated me is why Big Pharma doesn't really go through plant compounds and plant research. Why do they like the synthetics?
Well, interesting enough, a lot of the drugs we widely use originally come from plants, actually. One of the most well-known ones is quinine, for example, which was the first anti-malarial. It's really interesting because one of the biggest issues with using plants as natural remedies or therapeutics is the cost of getting them through clinical trials. The problem is you cannot patent a natural compound because you can't protect something that's available in nature. You'd have the ability to stop anybody else from using it.
So what did you do your PhD on and why?
So after I finished my master's in pharmacology, part of my master's actually landed up looking at a drug called artemisinin, which is extracted from a plant called Artemisia annua, which is a very common plant found all around the world. So when I started my PhD about 20 years ago, I think 5 million people died of malaria, 3 to 5. The numbers were never too sure because it's quite hard to say. Nowadays, it's around 250,000. Because this drug's now so widely available, I landed up being at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine for 10 years. And it was a fascinating time there because getting exposed to was a lot of the genetic side of disease. And then I was able to move into the whole sequencing of the genome. So I landed up working with the genomic sequencing project over at the Sanger Center and a team, like a global team, which was looking at taking all the newly sequenced malaria genome. It's quite interesting when it comes to bioavailability. Everyone has different bioavailability between men and women. That's also affected by your age, your diet particularly, and also your background in terms of your genetic background, your ethnic background too. So everyone has slightly different metabolism. And that's actually quite an important key too, because there you can actually say one person will have a different type of metabolism to another. And so because of that difference, diets affect our genetics incredibly. And bioavailability is actually another area that is in the same way.
So tell me about, obviously then, one of the things that's fascinated me, and you've got the background in this, is the pharmaceutical industry, curcumin. Notoriously incredible in a lot of studies, but we can't get it into the body. So what have you learnt about curcumin and what can you share with your knowledge of it?
As we all know, the problem with a lot of these compounds is they are very hydrophobic. In other words, they don't like water. The human body relies on a lot of compounds in order to pass from the stomach into the body, through the stomach lining and into the bloodstream. It requires some level of water solubility. And unfortunately, these compounds aren't very soluble in water. And that's the great thing about KURK, obviously, we get around that problem.
So that's why it's important for us to go, doesn't work, we don't want you to pay. Because of this sort of bioavailability, but also this genetic link and the metabolism, and people are sometimes trying to use it for something it doesn't work with, which is acute pain or acute inflammation. So tell me about, obviously, the Swansea Medical School, Lewis, Ruth and the team down there. What are we doing?
We applied for this grant called Analysis Innovators. So Swansea really were interested in working with us because they see this as a really interesting project because it brings together lots of different elements. Firstly, we've got the bioavailability side, so blood testing, looking at how many different people take up the compound, and we can also look at all the studies then for blood and bioavailability. And
we're trying to prove the absorption, because that's the biggest known issue with curcumin. And then we're trying to understand why we have such great results ourselves and with our customers. But we're trying to do it with scientific rigor, which is hard because it's not really known in this industry and not really done. And so part of what you've been able to add to us is we've got this research and development side. Like, what are we looking at? What are we seeing? Then we put it into pilot and we all try it and see how it goes. And then it gets into production, and then it gets a lot of customer feedback and all of our research results. And then we put that back into the original product. So we're on our 7th iteration of curcumin. And so that learning loop or that feedback loop is not done in the pharmaceutical industry, and it's not done in the supplement industry either. So why are we different? Because our work's never done. We want to constantly improve. What are you most excited about that we're working on with KURK?
I'm very excited also about all the research that's coming out. And I think that we're going to start, really showing some interesting research, both here in the UK and abroad. I'd like KURK to be the number one, curcumin compound supplement, say, in the world.
Yeah.
And people to know why they buy it, because it tastes great, it works, most importantly, and it's backed by science.
The whole idea how we've set this company up to be research-led, and that's research loop, learning loop, feedback loop, whatever we call it, means that we will continue to lead in that way.
For me, that's the most exciting.